The candlelight flickered across crystal glasses he'd never afford. Daniel Brooks stood frozen in the doorway, his cheap tie suddenly suffocating. This was supposed to be a simple thank-you dinner with his boss. But the two strangers seated at the mahogany table weren't colleagues. Their eyes measured him like an auction item. Cold, calculating, already disappointed. Before he could ask, slender fingers slipped through his arm. Charlotte Hale, CEO of everything he worked for, leaned into him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mom, Dad, this is my boyfriend." The words hit like ice water. He wasn't her boyfriend. He was a single father who'd skipped bedtime stories tonight for this. And now he understood. He hadn't been invited. He'd been cast. The morning had started like any other for Daniel Brooks. His alarm rang at 5:45, giving him exactly 15 minutes before Oliver's small feet would pad across the hallway into his room. He used that window to brew coffee, pack a lunchbox with the precision of a man who had done this alone for 4 years, and iron his only decent shirt. The fabric was wearing thin at the collar, but under a jacket, no one would notice. At least that's what he told himself every morning while standing in front of the bathroom mirror, wondering if today would be the day someone finally saw through the carefully constructed illusion of a man who had everything under control. Oliver appeared right on schedule, his hair a mess of brown curls that refused to be tamed by any comb Daniel had ever purchased. The boy was 7 now, old enough to sense when his father was tired, young enough to believe that a hug could fix anything. He wrapped his arms around Daniel's waist and pressed his face into the worn fabric of his father's shirt. "You smell like coffee," Oliver mumbled, his voice still thick with sleep. Daniel laughed softly and ran his fingers through those impossible curls. "And you smell like someone who needs a bath tonight." The boy groaned dramatically, and for a moment, the weight of everything else disappeared. This was enough. This had to be enough. At Hale Industries, Daniel occupied a small office on the 14th floor, wedged between the supply closet and the emergency stairwell. His official title was Creative Strategy Specialist, a term vague enough to mean everything and nothing. In practice, he was the person they called when a campaign was failing, when a client was walking, when someone needed to pull a miracle out of thin air with half the budget and twice the pressure. He was good at it. Better than good. But in a company where your last name determined your trajectory, being good was simply the minimum requirement for survival. Charlotte Hale existed in a different atmosphere entirely. The 32nd floor, where the air seemed thinner and the silence heavier, belonged to her. Daniel had seen her exactly 3 times in his 2 years at the company. Once at an all-hands meeting where she'd spoken about innovation and excellence, once in the elevator, where she'd glanced at him without recognition, and once through the glass walls of her corner office as he delivered documents her assistant had deemed too sensitive for email. She was beautiful in the way that expensive things are beautiful. Polished. Untouchable. The kind of woman whose photographs appeared in business magazines beside words like visionary and youngest CEO in company history. What Daniel didn't know, what no one on the 14th floor could possibly know, was that Charlotte Hale spent every Sunday dinner defending her life choices to parents who believed success meant nothing without a suitable partner. Harrison and Margaret Hale had built their fortune on real estate and their reputation on appearances. Their daughter running a company was acceptable. Their daughter running it, while single at 32, was a crisis that required intervention. They had presented her with options: sons of friends, heirs to other empires, men whose portfolios spoke louder than their personalities. Charlotte had rejected them all, but her rejections were running out of excuses. The project that changed everything arrived on a Tuesday. A major client was threatening to leave, taking 30% of the company's revenue with them. The presentation that was supposed to save the account had been deemed uninspired and forgettable. With 72 hours until the final pitch, Charlotte's executive team had produced nothing but panic and finger-pointing. Someone mentioned Daniel's name, a mid-level strategist who had salvaged the Henderson campaign last year. A nobody, really, but desperate times called for desperate measures. By Wednesday morning, Daniel found himself sitting across from Charlotte Hale in her corner office, the city sprawling beneath them like a promise he'd never been invited to keep. She studied him the way she studied quarterly reports, with precision and detached interest. "They tell me you're the one who saved Henderson," she said, her voice carrying no warmth, no curiosity, only assessment. Daniel shifted in his chair, acutely aware of the coffee stain on his cuff that he'd tried to hide under his sleeve. "I had a good team," he replied, "because that's what you said, when you were a nobody talking to someone who could end your career with a single phone call." Charlotte's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Modesty. How refreshing. She slid a folder across her desk. "I need you to do it again." "Better. You have until Friday." What followed were 60 hours that Daniel would later struggle to remember in sequence. He worked through Tuesday night, ordering dinner to the office, because going home meant admitting he might fail. He called Oliver at bedtime, listening to his son describe a drawing he'd made at school, a house with 2 stick figures holding hands, one tall, one small, while his eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets. He slept 2 hours on Wednesday, curled on the couch in the break room, and woke to 14 new emails from Charlotte's assistant requesting updates. By Thursday afternoon, he had something. Not perfect, but alive. A campaign that spoke to emotion instead of statistics, that told a story instead of listing features. He presented it to Charlotte at 6 p.m., his hand steady even though everything inside him trembled. She watched the presentation without expression, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. When it ended, silence filled the room like water rising. Daniel waited. Charlotte turned to face the window, the city lights beginning to flicker on below. "It's good," she said finally, and the 2 words landed heavier than any praise he'd ever received. She turned back to him, and for the first time, he saw something human in her eyes. Exhaustion, maybe. Or recognition. "The pitch is tomorrow at 10. I want you in the room." It wasn't a request. The pitch succeeded. The client stayed. And Daniel returned to his small office on the 14th floor, expecting life to resume its normal rhythm. Instead, he found an envelope on his desk. Inside, a handwritten note on cream-colored paper bearing the Hale Industries letterhead. "Dinner. Friday. 7 p.m. Consider it a thank you. Charlotte." His first instinct was to decline. Single fathers didn't have Friday nights free. Single fathers spent Friday nights helping with homework and arguing about bedtime and pretending they weren't lonely when the house finally went quiet. But his neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had been offering to babysit for months, and something about the way Charlotte had looked at him after the pitch, like she was seeing him for the first time, made him curious enough to be stupid. He spent an embarrassing amount of time choosing what to wear, ultimately settling on the same suit he'd worn to the pitch because it was the only one that didn't make him look like he was attending his own funeral. Oliver watched him from the doorway, his small face scrunched in confusion. "You look fancy," the boy observed. Daniel knelt down to meet his son's eyes. "I have a work dinner. Mrs. Patterson is going to make you her famous mac and cheese." Oliver considered this, then nodded solemnly. "Okay, but you have to tell me a story when you get home, even if I'm asleep." Daniel pulled him into a hug that lasted longer than necessary, breathing in the scent of strawberry shampoo and childhood. "I promise." The address Charlotte had sent led to a restaurant Daniel had only ever seen from the outside, one of those places where the menu didn't list prices, because if you had to ask, you couldn't afford it. He adjusted his tie in the reflection of the glass door and stepped inside, expecting to find Charlotte waiting at a table for two. Instead, A hostess in a black dress led him through the main dining room into a private space at the back, where candlelight danced across surfaces that gleamed with money. Charlotte was there, yes, dressed in emerald silk that made her look like something from a painting. But she wasn't alone. Two people sat across from her. A man in his 60s with silver hair and the kind of tan that came from winters spent somewhere warm. A woman beside him, elegant in pearls, her posture suggesting decades of finishing school. Their eyes found Daniel the moment he appeared in the doorway, and he felt their assessment like hands pressing against his chest. Charlotte rose from her seat, and before Daniel could ask what was happening, she crossed the distance between them and slipped her arm through his. Her touch was warm, her smile was flawless, and her next words shattered everything he thought he understood about this evening. "Mom, Dad, this is my boyfriend." Daniel's body went rigid. He turned to look at Charlotte, searching her face for some explanation, some indication that this was a joke he wasn't getting. But her expression remained perfectly composed, her grip on his arm tightening almost imperceptibly. A warning, a plea, he couldn't tell which. Across the room, Harrison Hale rose from his chair with the slow deliberation of a man accustomed to controlling every situation he entered. "So, this is the young man you've been hiding from us," he said, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a politician. His wife remained seated, her gaze traveling over Daniel with the precision of an appraiser determining value. The next few seconds stretched into hours inside Daniel's mind. He could correct her. He could step back, explain that there had been a mistake, apologize for the confusion, and walk out of this restaurant with his dignity intact. He could protect himself from whatever game Charlotte was playing, whatever purpose he was meant to serve in this carefully staged scene. But he also knew what that correction would cost. The embarrassment that would flood Charlotte's face, the satisfied smirk that would curl on her father's lips, the quiet devastation that would follow, for her career, for his, for whatever fragile thread of trust had been woven between them during those 60 sleepless hours. And underneath all of that calculation, something simpler. Oliver. The mortgage payment due next week, the health insurance that covered his son's asthma medication, the job that made everything else possible. He stayed. The dinner that followed was an elaborate performance that Daniel navigated on pure instinct. Charlotte's parents asked questions that sounded polite, but functioned as surgical instruments. Where did he grow up? What did his parents do? Where did he see himself in 10 years? Daniel answered carefully, offering truth when he could, vagueness when he couldn't. Yes, he had a son. No, he wasn't married anymore. Yes, he worked at the company, in creative strategy. Mid-level. Nothing impressive. Margaret Hale's eyebrows rose at that last admission. "Charlotte mentioned you saved the Morrison account," she said, and Daniel caught the flicker of surprise that crossed Charlotte's face. So she had talked about him. To them. Before tonight. The realization settled somewhere complicated in his chest. Harrison steered the conversation toward money with the subtlety of a freight train. Property values, investment portfolios, the vacation home in Martha's Vineyard that needed renovating. Daniel listened and nodded and tried to calculate how many years of his salary it would take to afford a single room in these people's world. The answer was depressing enough that he stopped calculating. At one point, Charlotte's hand found his under the table, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that was meant to look natural. Her palm was cold. Her pulse, pressing against his wrist, was racing. By the time dessert arrived, some architectural marvel of chocolate and gold leaf that Daniel couldn't bring himself to eat, Harrison Hale had formed his conclusion. "Well," he said, setting down his fork with finality, "you're certainly not what we expected." The words hung in the air, sharp enough to draw blood. Charlotte's grip on Daniel's hand tightened. "What did you expect?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with something dangerous. Her father smiled the smile of a man who had never lost an argument. Someone more established. But Charlotte has always enjoyed her projects. The drive home was silent until they reached Daniel's neighborhood, where the houses were smaller and the streetlights fewer. Charlotte pulled over to the curb, her hand still gripping the steering wheel, as if she needed something to hold on to. Daniel waited. He had learned over the past 4 years of single fatherhood that silence often extracted more truth than questions. Finally, she spoke. "I know you want an explanation." Her voice was different now, stripped of the performance, the polish. What remained sounded almost fragile. Daniel turned to look at her profile, lit by the orange glow of a distant street lamp. That would be a start, Charlotte laughed, but there was no humor in it. "My parents have been trying to marry me off since I turned 30. Every month, a new candidate. Every dinner, a new interview. Sons of their friends, mostly. Men with the right last names and the right portfolios, and absolutely nothing behind their eyes." She finally released the steering wheel, her hands falling to her lap. "I've been running out of excuses. And then you walked into my office with that presentation, and you didn't look at me like I was a prize to be won. You looked at me like I was a problem to be solved, and I thought—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "I thought you could be my shield, just for one dinner, just to buy me time." Daniel absorbed this in silence. He thought about Oliver waiting at home, probably asleep by now with Mrs. Patterson dozing in the armchair. He thought about the way Charlotte's parents had looked at him, like he was a stain on their daughter's otherwise pristine life. He thought about the years he had spent proving himself worthy of things that other people received simply by being born. "You should have asked me," he said finally. His voice came out quieter than he intended. "Instead of tricking me into a room full of people who think I'm not good enough for their daughter, you should have just asked." Charlotte turned to face him, and for the first time, he saw something real in her expression. Shame, maybe. Or the beginning of it. "Would you have said yes?" Daniel considered the question honestly. A week ago, the answer would have been simple. No, absolutely not. But something had shifted during those 60 hours of saving a deal that wasn't his responsibility, of watching Charlotte Hale crack under pressure and still refuse to break. He had seen her vulnerable. He had seen her fight. And that made her human in a way that her corner office never had. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I deserved the choice." She nodded slowly, accepting this. "You're right. I'm sorry." The apology sounded unfamiliar in her mouth, like a language she rarely spoke. Daniel reached for the door handle, then paused. "Your father called me a project," he said. "Is that what I am? Something for you to fix or improve or eventually discard?" The question surprised both of them. Charlotte's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked younger than her 32 years. Uncertain. "No," she said softly. "You're the first person in a very long time who made me feel like I didn't need fixing." Daniel held her gaze for a long moment, searching for the lie. He didn't find one. The following Monday, the office hummed with whispers. Daniel felt eyes on him the moment he stepped off the elevator. Curious glances, meaningful looks exchanged between colleagues who suddenly had something interesting to discuss. By noon, the rumor had crystallized into accepted fact. Daniel Brooks, the mid-level strategist from the 14th floor, was dating the CEO. The story spread through departments like wildfire, gaining embellishments with each retelling. Some versions had them meeting at a charity gala. Others suggested a secret romance that had been brewing for months. A few, closer to cruel, speculated about what Daniel must have done to earn such improbable luck. He tried to focus on work, but concentration proved elusive. His inbox filled with messages from people who had never acknowledged his existence before. Invitations to lunch, requests for collaboration, thinly veiled attempts to extract information. Daniel deleted them all and spent his lunch hour alone in the break room, staring at a sandwich he had no appetite to eat. His phone buzzed. A text from Charlotte. "I know what they're saying. I'm sorry. Can we talk? My office, 6 p.m. He typed and deleted a dozen responses before settling on a single word. Okay. At 6, the 32nd floor was nearly empty. Charlotte's assistant had already left, leaving the glass doors to her office unlocked. Daniel found her standing by the window, silhouette sharp against the fading daylight. She turned when she heard him enter, and he noticed the shadows under her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. "Close the door," she said. It wasn't a command. It was a request from someone who had run out of commanding. Daniel closed the door and waited. Charlotte crossed to her desk, but didn't sit. Instead, she leaned against its edge, her arms folded across her chest in a posture that looked more defensive than authoritative. "My parents called this morning," she began. "Apparently, they've done some research. They know your ex-wife left when Oliver was 3. They know you rent a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood they've never heard of. They know your salary down to the last dollar." She paused, her jaw tightening. "They think I've lost my mind." Daniel felt something cold settle in his stomach. "And what do you think?" Charlotte met his eyes. "I think my parents have spent their entire lives measuring people by the wrong metrics. And I think I've spent most of mine trying to prove I'm not like them while doing exactly what they taught me to do." She pushed off from the desk and moved toward him, stopping close enough that he could see the pulse jumping in her throat. "I used you, Daniel. I put you in an impossible position to serve my own needs, and I told myself it was harmless because one dinner doesn't change anything. But it did. For you. For both of us. And I don't know how to fix it, but I want to try." The sincerity in her voice caught him off guard. Daniel had expected defensiveness, justification, perhaps even dismissal. Instead, he got something that looked like the beginning of accountability. "There's a project," he said slowly, pulling together thoughts that had been forming since that night in the car. "The Westbrook Initiative. I've been reviewing the preliminary proposals, and they're missing something. I think I could help." Charlotte frowned, confused by the apparent change in subject. "What does that have to do with everything?" Daniel interrupted. "You want to fix this? Let me prove that I belong in whatever room you put me in. Not because of some fake relationship, but because I earned it. Give me Westbrook." The Westbrook Initiative was the largest project the company had undertaken in 5 years. A complete rebranding for a tech conglomerate that was trying to shed its reputation as a privacy nightmare and emerge as a trusted innovator. The budget was enormous, the stakes were higher, and the team assigned to it had been hand-picked from the company's brightest minds. Daniel's name had never been mentioned in connection with it. Until now. Charlotte studied him with an expression he couldn't read. "That's a significant ask." Daniel shrugged, surprising himself with how steady his voice remained. "You put me in your family's living room and called me your boyfriend. I think significant asks are already on the table." Something flickered across her face. Admiration, maybe, or the beginning of respect that had nothing to do with who was dating whom. "You'll need to present to the board," she said finally. "Convince them you belong there. I can open the door, but I can't carry you through it." Daniel nodded. "I wouldn't want you to." The weeks that followed transformed Daniel's existence at Hale Industries. He was added to the Westbrook team over the objections of several senior executives who didn't bother to hide their disdain. His ideas were challenged, his presence was questioned, and every contribution was scrutinized for evidence of favoritism. But Daniel had spent 4 years proving himself worthy to a system that preferred to overlook him. This was just a larger stage. He worked harder than he had ever worked, arriving before anyone else and leaving after the cleaning staff. He called Oliver every night at bedtime, telling stories through the phone while his son's voice grew sleepier with each word. He missed dinners and weekends and the small moments that had once constituted his entire life. The campaign he developed for Westbrook was different from anything the company had produced before. Instead of promising redemption through corporate speak, he told a story about second chances, about ordinary people who had made mistakes and fought their way back, about trust being rebuilt one small action at a time. It was personal in a way that made the senior executives uncomfortable and revolutionary in a way that made them listen anyway. When he presented it to the board, his hands didn't shake, his voice didn't waver. He spoke from a place of earned authority, and when he finished, the silence that followed felt different from the silence in Charlotte's office all those weeks ago. This silence was respect. Harrison Hale attended the presentation. Daniel hadn't known he would be there. Charlotte's father maintained a seat on the board despite his retirement, an honorary position that allowed him to keep one hand on the wheel of his daughter's company. When Daniel finished speaking, he found the old man's eyes fixed on him with an intensity that felt like being X-rayed. The vote that followed was unanimous. Westbrook would use Daniel's campaign, and Harrison Hale remained in his seat for a long moment after the others filed out, watching Daniel gather his materials with an expression that was impossible to decode. Charlotte found Daniel in his office that evening, a bottle of champagne in her hand, and something that looked almost like joy on her face. "You did it," she said, closing the door behind her. "The board is calling it the most innovative proposal they've seen in years." "My father said—" She stopped abruptly, as if catching herself. Daniel looked up from his desk. "What did your father say?" Charlotte hesitated, then laughed softly. "He said you reminded him of himself 40 years ago, before he had anything except ambition and stubbornness." The compliment landed strangely in Daniel's chest. He wasn't sure he wanted to remind Harrison Hale of anything. "Is that supposed to be flattering?" Charlotte set the champagne on his desk and perched on the edge of it, much as she had in her own office weeks before. But something had shifted between them. The distance felt smaller. "My father is a complicated man. He built something from nothing, and then he spent the rest of his life terrified of losing it. That fear made him hard. It made him measure everyone by what they could threaten rather than what they could offer." She met Daniel's eyes. "He's wrong about most things, but he's not wrong about you. You belong here." Daniel leaned back in his chair, allowing himself, for the first time in weeks, to feel something other than exhaustion. "What happens now?" he asked. "With us, I mean. With whatever this is." Charlotte picked up the champagne, turning it slowly in her hands. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never done this before. The real version, I mean. Without the performance." Daniel reached out and took the bottle from her, setting it aside. "Then maybe we start there," he said. "No audience, no parents, just two people figuring out if they actually like each other." The relationship that grew between them over the following months was nothing like the fiction Charlotte had presented to her parents. It was slow, uncertain, and punctuated by Daniel's anxieties about whether he was being chosen or merely tolerated. They had dinner, real dinners, at restaurants Daniel could afford, where the food was good and the expectations were low. Charlotte met Oliver on a rainy Saturday afternoon, kneeling down to his level and asking about his drawings with a sincerity that couldn't be faked. She didn't try to be his mother. She tried to be his friend. And Oliver, with the uncomplicated wisdom of childhood, decided he liked her because she laughed at his jokes and didn't mind when he beat her at video games. Harrison and Margaret Hale were another matter entirely. Charlotte's mother maintained a polite coldness that never quite thawed, addressing Daniel with the careful courtesy reserved for servants who had momentarily forgotten their place. Harrison was more direct. He cornered Daniel at a company event, champagne flute in hand, and calculation in his eyes. "Let me be frank with you," he said, his voice low enough that nearby conversations provided cover. My daughter is the most valuable thing I've ever created, and you are a risk I haven't fully assessed. Daniel felt the familiar surge of defensiveness rise in his throat, but he forced it down. He had learned, over years of navigating a world that didn't want him, that anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. With respect, Mr. Hale, your daughter isn't something you created. She's someone who made herself, often in spite of the expectations placed on her. Harrison's eyes narrowed. And you think you understand her better than I do? Daniel set down his own glass, meeting the older man's gaze without flinching. I think I see her more clearly, because I don't have 40 years of projections clouding my vision. The confrontation should have ended Daniel's welcome in the Hale orbit. Instead, it seemed to shift something in Harrison's assessment. The hostility didn't disappear, but it transformed into something closer to grudging curiosity. At the next family dinner, an invitation that Charlotte had extended with obvious trepidation, Harrison asked Daniel about his work on Westbrook, not with condescension, but with the genuine interest of a man who still missed being in the arena. They argued about strategy for an hour while Charlotte and her mother watched in bewildered silence. It wasn't acceptance, but it was something. The crisis came, as crises do, without warning. A competitor leaked internal documents suggesting that Charlotte had fast-tracked Daniel's involvement in Westbrook as a personal favor to her boyfriend. The story hit industry publications on a Tuesday morning and spread to mainstream outlets by Wednesday. Daniel's inbox exploded. His phone rang constantly, and the whispers that had followed him since that first dinner with Charlotte's parents transformed into something louder and more vicious. He wasn't just the lucky nobody who was dating the CEO. He was the gold digger, the opportunist, the man who had slept his way into a position he didn't deserve. Charlotte wanted to fight. She drafted press releases, demanded retractions, threatened legal action against anyone who printed unverified claims. Daniel watched her mobilize with the efficiency of a general preparing for war, and he felt something complicated twist in his chest. Gratitude, yes, but also exhaustion. And underneath that, a question that had been forming since that first night. Was he here because he had earned it, or because Charlotte had decided he should be? That night, Daniel sat alone in his apartment after Oliver had fallen asleep. The resignation letter glowed on his laptop screen, cursor blinking at the end of the final sentence. 2 weeks' notice. Professional. Clean. He could walk away from Hale Industries, from Charlotte, from this entire performance that had spiraled beyond anyone's control. He could find another job, maybe in a smaller company, where nobody knew his name or cared who he was dating. He could protect Oliver from the whispers that would eventually reach the schoolyard, from the questions that children shouldn't have to answer about their fathers. The cursor blinked, the letter waited, and Daniel stared at the wall where Oliver's drawings hung, stick figures holding hands, a house with a crooked chimney, a son that smiled because his son believed sons could smile. He thought about what leaving would mean, not just for his career, but for everything he had built since that first dinner. Charlotte had used him, yes, but she had also seen him, really seen him, in a way that most people never bothered to try. And the work he had done on Westbrook, that was real. That was his. Walking away now would confirm every accusation, validate every sneer, prove that he had never belonged in those rooms in the first place. It would be the safe choice, the dignified choice, the choice that protected his son from a world that measured worth in last names and net worth. But it would also be surrender. And Daniel Brooks had spent too many years fighting to give up now. He deleted the resignation letter, not because he was certain he was making the right choice, but because certainty was a luxury he had never been able to afford. The only thing he knew for sure was that running had never solved anything. If they wanted to destroy him, they would have to do it while he was standing up. He found her in her office at midnight, surrounded by legal documents and media strategy memos. "Stop!" he said from the doorway. Charlotte looked up, her eyes red-rimmed from hours of reading. "I'm not stopping. They're lying about you. About us. I won't let them." "I said stop." Daniel crossed the room and took the papers from her hands, setting them aside. "This isn't your fight." Charlotte's face contorted with frustration. "Of course it's my fight. I brought you into this. I created the target on your back." Daniel shook his head slowly. "You opened a door. What happened after I walked through it is my responsibility. And I need to be the one who proves them wrong." The board meeting was scheduled for Thursday. Daniel requested the opportunity to address the allegations directly, and Charlotte, with obvious reluctance, agreed to let him try. The night before, he sat on Oliver's bed and read him 3 stories instead of 1, because some part of him feared it might be the last normal night for a while. Oliver fell asleep with his hand curled around Daniel's fingers, and Daniel stayed there in the darkness, listening to his son breathe, wondering if he had made the right choice at every turning point that had led him here. Thursday arrived with the grim inevitability of a court date. Daniel dressed in his best suit, the one he had worn to that first dinner, the one Charlotte's parents had silently dismissed, and took the elevator to the 32nd floor. The boardroom was full. Every face that had ever doubted him was present, watching with expressions that ranged from sympathy to poorly concealed satisfaction. Charlotte sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid, her hands folded in front of her like someone bracing for impact. Daniel didn't sit. He stood at the end of the table, where everyone could see him, and he began to speak. Not about the allegations at first, about his father, who had worked 2 jobs and died of a heart attack at 53. About his ex-wife, who had decided that motherhood was a burden she couldn't carry, and had left him alone with a 3-year-old who cried for her every night. About the years of proving himself to companies that saw him as replaceable, of raising a child without help, of building a life out of nothing but stubbornness and love. And then, only then, about the work. The campaigns he had saved, the ideas he had generated, the project that was now bringing this company more positive attention than it had received in a decade. When he finished, the silence was absolute. Harrison Hale, seated to Charlotte's right, studied Daniel with an expression that had finally shed its calculation. "I've built 3 companies," the old man said slowly, his voice carrying through the room. "I've met thousands of people who wanted something from me. Most of them were forgettable. Some were dangerous." He paused, letting the weight of his history fill the space. "But I've never met anyone who walked into a room full of people waiting to destroy them and spoke with nothing but the truth." He turned to his daughter, and something passed between them that Daniel couldn't interpret. "You chose well." The vote was symbolic. Daniel's position was never really in question after his speech, but it mattered anyway. Unanimous support. The allegations were dismissed as competitive sabotage, and the story shifted from scandal to vindication. Within a week, the same outlets that had questioned Daniel's credentials were writing profiles about the single father who had gone from nobody to industry leader. He declined most of the interviews. He had nothing to prove to strangers, but there was one conversation he couldn't decline. Charlotte told him her parents wanted to meet, privately, at their home, without the buffer of a boardroom or the distraction of business. Daniel could have refused. He had every right to. But something in Charlotte's voice when she asked, something that sounded like hope mixed with fear, made him say yes. The Hale estate sprawled across 3 acres of manicured grounds, the kind of property that existed in a different universe from the 2-bedroom apartment where Daniel read bedtime stories. A housekeeper led him through marble hallways to a sitting room, where Harrison and Margaret waited like judges preparing to deliver a verdict. Charlotte was notably absent. This was between Daniel and the people who had dismissed him from the moment he walked through that restaurant door. Harrison spoke first. "Sit down, Mr. Brooks." It wasn't an invitation. Daniel remained standing. I'd prefer to stand, if it's all the same to you. The old man's eyebrows rose, but he said nothing. Margaret's lips thinned into a line that might have been disapproval or grudging respect. The silence stretched until it became its own kind of conversation. I'm not here to apologize, Daniel said finally, his voice steady. I'm not here to explain myself or justify my existence, or convince you that I'm worthy of your daughter. I've spent my entire life proving myself to people who had already decided I wasn't enough. And I'm done. He met Harrison's eyes without flinching. I'm a single father. I work hard. I love my son more than anything in this world, and I would do anything to give him a good life. That's who I am. That's all I am. And if that's not enough for you, then nothing I say in this room will change your mind. Margaret shifted in her seat, something flickering across her carefully composed face. Harrison remained motionless, his expression unreadable. Daniel continued, because he had started, and there was no point in stopping now. Your daughter didn't choose me to impress you. She chose me because I was convenient. And then somewhere along the way, something real happened. I don't know what this is between us, and I don't know where it's going. But I know that I won't let anyone, not the media, not your friends, not you, make me feel like I don't deserve to be here. The room fell silent. Harrison Hale, a man who had built empires and destroyed competitors, sat perfectly still in his leather chair. When he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the condescension Daniel had come to expect. My father was a carpenter, he said slowly, as if pulling the words from somewhere deep and rarely visited. He built furniture with his hands until his back gave out at 60. I spent my entire adult life running from that man, from what he represented. I told myself I was building something better, something that would last. He paused, his gaze drifting to the window and the manicured grounds beyond. I forgot that he built things that lasted too. Tables that families still eat at. Chairs that hold grandchildren. Real things, made by real hands. Margaret reached over and placed her hand on her husband's arm, a small gesture that spoke of decades of partnership. Harrison turned back to Daniel, and for the first time, the assessment in his eyes had been replaced by something that looked almost like recognition. You remind me of him, he said quietly. Not of who I became, of who he was. And I think that might be exactly what my daughter needs. It wasn't acceptance, not yet. But it was an opening, a crack in the wall that had seemed insurmountable. Daniel nodded once, acknowledging what had passed between them without diminishing it with unnecessary words. Some conversations were better left unfinished, allowed to grow in the silence that followed. Charlotte found him that evening in his office, where he was packing up to go home to Oliver. She leaned against the doorframe, watching him with eyes that held something new. Not the assessment of their first meeting, not the desperation of that dinner with her parents. Something softer. Something that looked like the beginning of forever. My father wants you to come to Sunday dinner, she said. Just you this time. He says he wants to talk about your vision for the company. Daniel paused his packing. Is that what he really wants to talk about? Charlotte smiled, and it reached her eyes. Probably not. But it's the excuse he needs to admit he was wrong about you. She crossed the room and stood in front of him, close enough that he could count the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. I was wrong too. That first night. I thought I was using you to solve a problem. I didn't realize you were the answer to a question I didn't even know I was asking. Daniel reached out and took her hand, remembering how cold it had been under that mahogany table, how fast her pulse had raced against his wrist. Her fingers were warm now. Steady. I'm not a shield, he said quietly. And I'm not a project. Charlotte nodded. I know. You're the man I want to build something real with, if you'll let me." Oliver was awake when Daniel got home, waiting at the window with Mrs. Patterson hovering nearby. The boy launched himself at his father the moment the door opened, chattering about a drawing he'd made at school. Daniel listened and nodded, and felt the tight knot in his chest finally begin to loosen. Later, after bedtime stories and tucking in, and the quiet ritual of checking that the nightlight was on, he stood in the doorway of his son's room and watched the small chest rise and fall with the peaceful breathing of a child who had never doubted that his father would come home. He thought about Charlotte's question in his office, about building something real, about the unexpected path that had brought him from obscurity to the inner circle of people who had once looked through him like he was made of glass. He thought about his own father, who had worked himself to death for a fraction of what Daniel had now. And he thought about the man he had become, not because someone had opened a door for him, but because he had walked through it with nothing but the truth of who he was. 6 months later, Daniel Brooks stood in a different doorway, the entrance to a house that was bigger than anything he had ever imagined owning, but still small enough to feel like home. Oliver ran past him into the backyard, where Charlotte was already setting up for the birthday party they had planned together. Balloons, a cake shaped like a dinosaur, a guest list that included both classmates and senior executives. An impossible combination that somehow worked. Charlotte looked up as Daniel approached, her hair escaping its braid, frosting smeared on her cheek. She had never looked more beautiful. "Your parents called," she said, wiping her hands on her jeans. "They want to know if Oliver can spend next weekend at their place." The words landed with a weight that Daniel still wasn't entirely used to. Harrison and Margaret Hale, wanting to spend time with his son. Not because they had to, but because somewhere along the way, they had learned to see what Daniel had always seen: a child worth loving, a family worth joining. "What did you tell them?" Daniel asked, slipping his arms around her waist. Charlotte leaned into him, her smile carrying the warmth of all the walls they had dismantled together. "I told them I'd ask his father." She tilted her face up to his, and in her eyes, he saw none of the calculation that had once defined her world. Only certainty, only choice, only love. "Tell them yes," Daniel said. And then he kissed her, while their son laughed in the backyard, and the future stretched before them. Not a performance, not a role, but a life they had both earned, one impossible choice at a time.